Kwe Tansei Seigo. My name is Pam Palmater and welcome back to State of the Nations, my new YouTube channel which will discuss critical issues impacting Indigenous peoples all over our sovereign territories on Turtle Island. Today I will be talking about a story that should have been all over the media earlier this week, the release of the United Nations report from the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination on Canada's ongoing violations against Indigenous peoples. Instead, this news report was overshadowed by the Prime Minister's flashy announcement that instead of one terrible Department of Indian Affairs, we're now going to have two terrible Departments of Indian Affairs. But that's a story for another video. This video relates specifically to that UN report and its significance to Indigenous people right now. This report was really the culmination of a whole bunch of factors. So on August 14th and 15th, Canadian officials as well as NGOs and Indigenous peoples all traveled to Geneva to hear the committee's review and questioning of Canada's racial discrimination record here in Canada. Canada's report obviously portrayed itself in a very good light, like there weren't any problems here in Canada, and that's why the United Nations always provides a space so that non-government organizations, NGOs, and Indigenous peoples and other interested parties can come and make a written submission or make an oral presentation to the committee on statistics and facts and research that Canada either doesn't present in its report or presents incorrectly in its report. And this is very important information. The reports that we submit based on the research and facts that we have done are often called shadow reports, and I'll provide links below so that you can read the shadow report that we submitted to the UN CERD committee. The reason why Canada is called to report before these treaty bodies is because the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination was passed by the UN General Assembly in 1965. It was signed by Canada in 1966 and then came into force in 1969. So Canada has an obligation not just to take actions here at home to prevent racial discrimination, but also to report and account for its ongoing activity. And this is an important part of the process. Now, Canada's report, like I said, presented itself to be very well, but I think the United Nations got a very different perspective from the large number of Indigenous representatives that attended. There were First Nations leaders and grassroots leaders from all over Canada that attended, including those from BC, those representing First Nation Kids in Care, Cindy Blackstock, and myself, for example, who addressed very core issues for the committee. Now, one of the core recommendations was on racism. So this committee expressed real concern that Canada has a problem with racism and that it's not doing enough to have an anti-racism strategy in its country or in terms of legislation. So to that extent, they made sure that their recommendations included anti-racism legislation, that they take better steps to report on and address the rise in hate crimes, and also to start sharing publicly the data on convictions for things like hate crime. Because part of the problem is that Canada is always able to present statistics on victims, but they are not always able to present statistics on what they do for those victims, like conviction rates. And so that was a very important recommendation. Another related concern that the United Nations had was specifically on ongoing racial profiling by police forces, security agents, and border officials specifically targeted at Indigenous peoples, which they said was very harmful to our lives. And It goes without saying what happens when we're specifically targeted, we're put on terrorist watch lists, we're over incarcerated in prison, there's deaths by police shootings, or, you know, a whole range of things. And I think the United Nations got a very clear message that this is a very significant problem. So to that end, they recommended training for all of these police and law enforcement officials, but more than just training, because training has been very ineffective in the past, is they want Canada to implement mechanisms which make sure that these police officers and other law enforcement agencies are forced to comply so that actual racial profiling will stop. And even more than that, they want Canada to address the root causes of what brings people into conflict with the law, like homelessness, like poverty, like lack of access and equitable access to core social services. So that was a very important recommendation that they made. Now, one recommendation that we weren't surprised at all, and we had hoped that they would make, is recommendations related to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and their 94 calls to action. So while the United Nations was pleased that the TRC has issued its report, they were concerned that Canada has taken little action to actually implement those 94 calls to action, and they expressed even greater concern that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, often called UNDRIP or UNDRIP, has not been implemented into law yet. And that was one of the issues that we had stressed over and over in our submissions. And so their recommendation was that Canada comes up with a national action plan to implement all 94 recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and further that it actually and finally implement UNDRIP into law. And more than just that, that they make sure that all national laws are amended so that they're compliant with and in conformity with all of the articles under UNDRIP, which would be substantive amendments to Canada's laws and legislation, and obviously something that's very well needed. Now, something that relates to UNDRIP and the TRC calls to action are Indigenous land rights. There was a large number of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous leaders at Geneva, at the United Nations, speaking very passionately about Canada's continued failure to really recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples specific to lands, and that they're going ahead and approving projects without free, prior and informed consent of Indigenous peoples to our own disadvantage. And so the United Nations expressed concern about ongoing land violations and actually said that Canada was making environmentally destructive decisions with regards to Indigenous land rights without our free, prior and informed consent. And that was key in terms of the recommendations that they made, because there were some very strong recommendations. One is that all laws and regulations and environmental review process in Canada must include free, prior and informed consent of Indigenous peoples. I mean, that would literally change the foundation of decision making in this country, and I think that's an important recommendation. And to this end, they also made some recommendations for specific situations in Canada. On the Site C dam, they said that Canada should halt all permits, leases, licenses, and authorizations on the Site C dam unless and until they have the free, prior and informed consent of Indigenous peoples. So that's a huge recommendation to make. And the other one they made was with regards to the Mount Polley disaster. And what they want to happen is for all of the reports and information related to the Mount Polley disaster to be released publicly, and for the government to do a criminal investigation to see if any criminal charges can be pressed before the statute of limitations runs out, and then so much time has gone by that you can't charge anyone for any criminal activity that may or may not have happened. And while those are only two specific examples, they're very much aware and want follow-up reporting on ongoing land violations for Indigenous peoples in Canada. Now, one of the issues that I had brought forward, as well as other people, is the issue of violence, ongoing violence against Indigenous women and girls, and they made some very specific and strong statements around murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, specifically that they were alarmed at the rate of murders and disappearances, and that they continue. And while they welcomed the national inquiry, they weren't pleased with how the national inquiry was unraveling. So, for example, they said that the inquiry was not being accountable, it wasn't being transparent, and it certainly wasn't communicating with families or other stakeholders. And these are the very same concerns that we have brought forward to Canada, and they're just reinforcing that even they can see that that's the case. And so to this end, they want Canada to take a multi-pronged approach. One is to take concrete action to address violence against Indigenous women and girls, not wait for the inquiry to unfold. And I think that's another important thing that we've been advocating for. And the other thing they want is for the inquiry to be based on a human rights framework, for there to be an independent review and assessment of all of the individual cases of murdered and missing Indigenous women to look for patterns. And they also want, obviously, more communication and more supports for the Indigenous families and stakeholders to participate in an inquiry process. And so these were very strong recommendations with regards to the inquiry. And a related issue, obviously, is their comments around First Nations kids in foster care. Now, Cindy Blackstock also traveled to the United Nations, and she made very impassioned, strong submissions to the committee and said, look, if Canada can't abide by its own domestic courts and its own decisions saying you have to recognize the equality of First Nation kids in care, then of course it's not going to abide by the human rights of Indigenous peoples on other issues. And I think that really impacted the committee, because they said that they were in fact alarmed that Canada has ignored previous UN recommendations and also ignored the Canadian human rights decisions, which have all said stop racially discriminating against First Nation kids in foster care. Provide equal funding, provide equal services, and address the root causes. That's what the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal said, and the United Nations CERD committee also supported them, and they also said implement Jordan's principle. It's there, you've been directed to do it by Canadian courts, and it's time that it be implemented. And also address root causes like ongoing poverty, like the housing crisis, the core or primary reasons why kids are taken away from our families to begin with. Then we wouldn't have this problem. So these again were very core recommendations, thanks to the strong advocacy of people like Cindy Blackstock. And a much related recommendation, and the final recommendation that I'll review, is one on education. And we weren't sure whether or not the committee would actually address this because they had addressed so many other issues. But they said, just like they said for First Nations foster care and the discrimination around the funding, that they were very, very alarmed that action hadn't been taken to deal with equitable education. And they strongly recommended that Canada ensure that First Nations are provided with equitable education services, no less than that Canadians receive, both on and off reserve. And that's key, because almost half of our population lives off of reserve, and we don't want a disparity in education levels whether they live on or off reserve. And they also told Canada directly to address the funding inequities, to stop providing less funding for First Nations for education than they do to other Canadians. And these are the kinds of recommendations that we have been making for many, many years. So it's really important that the UN could see this inequity and made strong recommendations to Canada in that nature. Now, this report isn't perfect. It's very limited in scope. It can't deal with all of the issues, just like our own submissions. We couldn't possibly deal with every issue of racial discrimination in Canada, so each of our organizations had to focus very specifically. My focus was on murdered and missing Indigenous women, gender inequality in the Indian Act, socioeconomic conditions of Indigenous women and little girls, and things like that, whereas Cindy Blackstock was more focused on First Nation kids in care, and other people were focused on land rights. And so what we tried to do was not have any overlap, but make sure that we were covering as many issues as possible. Now, what we would like to have seen are much stronger recommendations around the over-incarceration of Indigenous peoples, and in particular Indigenous women and little girls. And we had hoped for recommendations around decarcerization of Indigenous women and alternatives to prison sentences. We had also hoped for some stronger recommendations specific to the police. Now, while there was a lot mentioned about the police, we wanted some very strong recommendations around addressing police sexualized violence and against Indigenous women and girls, and we didn't get it this time around, and we didn't get a recommendation regarding gender inequality in the Indian Act and wanting Bill S3 to finally eliminate that gender inequality. But that being said, it's important to note that some of these issues have been addressed in other treaty body reports from other United Nations human rights committees. So it's not like everything had to be in this report. But despite any gaps or any exclusions from this report, if Canada were to implement all of the recommendations that are just contained in this report, even though they're not complete, it would make a substantive improvement to the lives of Indigenous peoples in Canada. And we have long known that. These are the same kind of recommendations that the Office of the Correctional Investigator, the Auditor General for Canada, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we've heard the same recommendations over and over again. It's simply up to Canada now to make the choice and do what's right, to do what they're legally obligated to do, let alone morally obligated. So this clearly was the news story that should have captured the media's attention this week, but didn't. It was overshadowed by the Prime Minister's announcement about two departments of Indian Affairs, and I will address that issue in the next video. And I will also post links to our submissions and the UN report and other related material in the description box down below. Thank you for watching another episode of State of the Nations. If you would like to support more episodes in this channel, please consider subscribing in the links below, liking the video, and sharing the video with your friends, your family, and social justice allies so that we can restore the original treaty vision that was meant for this territory of mutual respect, mutual prosperity, and mutual protection. Thank you.